We often hear that history prepares us to live in the present, but On Tyranny offers lessons more explicit than historians often permit themselves. 20 concrete acts that anyone can do to defend democracy, such as do not obey in advance, contribute to good causes, and be calm when the unthinkable arrives. Many of the lessons in the book represent the values of the humanities rendered in applied fashion. For example, be kind to our language, investigate, and believe in truth. The author, of course, is Timothy Snyder. The epilogue of the book is especially moving, and I'll quote, "Until recently," Professor Snyder writes, "we Americans had convinced ourselves that there was nothing in the future but more of the same. We allowed ourselves to accept the politics of inevitability, the sense that history could move in only one direction, toward liberal democracy. The politics of inevitability is a self-induced intellectual coma." A second anti-historical way of considering the past, Snyder goes on, is the politics of eternity. Like the politics of inevitability, the politics of eternity performs a masquerade of history, though a different one. It is concerned with the past, but in a self-absorbed way, free of any real concern with facts. Its mood is a longing for past moments that never really happened during epochs that were in fact disastrous. In the politics of eternity, the seduction by a mythicized past prevents us from thinking about possible futures. At the very end of the book, the following was Snyder's warning circa 2017. Quote, "If the politics of inevitability is like a coma, the politics of eternity is like hypnosis. We stare at the spinning vortex of cyclical myth until we fall into a trance, and then we do something shocking at someone else's orders. The danger we face now is of a passage from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity, from a naive and flawed sort of democratic republic to a confused and cynical sort of fascist oligarchy." End of quote. Now, Professor Snyder has published 8 books as sole author and co-authored or edited several more, but I've lingered over On Tyranny here because of what we might consider its unwritten 21st lesson, that history can have a great influence when an accomplished historian, drawing on vast learning and a broad perspective, speaks to us directly, and we might say urgently, in a new voice. This small book lends even greater coherence to a scholarly corpus that extends from Snyder's first book, a biography of the Polish philosopher Kazimierz Kelles-Krauz, to his chilling analysis of our present moment in The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, which appeared 20 years after his first book in 2018. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His writing, much translated, has received a number of prizes, including the Emerson Prize in the Humanities, the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Václav Havel Foundation Prize, and the Hannah Arendt Prize in Political Thought. Educated at Brown and Oxford, Professor Snyder was a Marshall Scholar, has received the Carnegie and Guggenheim Fellowships, and holds state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. He's working on a history of Eastern Europe, as well as a family history of nationalism, and completing a short book about the history of Ukraine and its current crisis. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder on The 5 Forms of Freedom.
Thank you very much, Roland, and thanks to all of you for the kind welcome. Greetings to friends and colleagues at Stanford and worldwide. I appreciate Roland's effort to bring my career to a point. What Roland has very nicely done is set up what I was meaning to do in On Tyranny, which is to say that, as he quite rightly explained, that history can serve us in the present day. It takes a certain amount of courage to draw conclusions about a difficult present on the basis of the past, But it's those little bits of courage that I think all of us need. What I'm trying to do in this lecture is take the next step. What I'm going to try to do in this lecture is not speak about how freedom is defended, but rather to try to make a case for how freedom can be advanced. What I'd very much like to do, that is to say, how I would like to take advantage of this very kind invitation, this wonderful occasion, is to try to say something new about the future, or about how the future could be. The subject today is the 5 forms of freedom. And my purpose today is to make the case that things can be much, much better than they are, and that things could be much, much better than they are if we start from getting a word right that I think we're getting wrong. And that word, as you will have guessed, is freedom. So let me make 3 points about how we talk about freedom, 3 ways in which I think we get freedom wrong, or 3 ways in which freedom has become a problem for us. So one way has to do with, let's call it a divergent usage. On the American left, we find many people who wisely advocate policies which, in my view, would advance freedom, but in general, people on the left avoid the term. Insofar as they refer to values to justify their policies, they're probably different values, such as equality or justice. These are very important values, but as I'd like to argue in this talk, most of the policies that the left maintains would be good ideas would be best justified, in my view, in terms of freedom. On the right, we have a very difficult problem. On the right, we use the word freedom, and on the right, we correctly say, in my view, that freedom is the highest value. But what we often mean on the right in the United States when we use the word freedom is unfortunately nonsensical or Orwellian. I could give a number of examples, but let me just constrain myself to 2. One way in which American right-wing freedom actually works against itself, or one way that we talk about freedom that undermines freedom, is to treat freedom as being relativist and collectivist. In other words, when we say that freedom is about making sure that government services are available to no one, and then we look at others and imagine that since others are doing worse than we, since others, for example, are held behind our border by a wall, or others are incarcerated in higher rates than we are, we imagine that that makes us free. That is a sadly reduced and even perverted notion of freedom. The idea that, and many American whites implicitly have this idea, the idea that freedom means I'm less likely to be arrested and other people are more likely to be arrested. That's no longer an idea of freedom at all. It's tribal, it's relative, and it has nothing to do with individuals. A second example of how the American right uses freedom in a way which is perverse and self-destructive is that it cedes the word freedom to entities, abstractions, fictions. It cedes the word freedom to things that don't exist. There are lots of examples of this, but the most common one in American usage is the free market. So my view as a humanist is that we should not be putting the word free in front of anything except people, or we should have a very, very strong reason why we're doing so. Because as soon as we discursively give freedom away, we find ourselves very quickly thereafter politically, socially giving freedom away. So to speak of the free market, of course, is to summon up a fiction. There's no such thing as a free market. Markets only work thanks to government intervention. Markets require laws, as any historian can tell you. And so the only question is, how do you balance laws and capitalism? But there's a deeper problem here, which is that when one transfers freedom to this fiction, what we end up doing is talking about things that we can't do. If you embrace the idea of the free market, what you end up saying is, well, We can't intervene in the market. We may not intervene in the market. We're forbidden from intervening in the market. We've literally given freedom away to this thing, and suddenly this thing is telling us what we cannot do. So speaking of the free market, although it's called libertarian, is actually a form of submission. So that's the first problem. The left doesn't use the term, although it may have some decent policies. The right correctly thinks that freedom is the highest value, but unfortunately not just undermines, but probably destroys its meaning in the way that it applies the term in real life. A second American problem with the way we discuss freedom has to do with positive and negative freedom. So in the United States, we're very attached to the idea that freedom is negative. That is to say, freedom is just about something not being in your way. Freedom is just about the absence of hindrances. And this draws us towards the idea that freedom is just about the government not making trouble for us. But this version of freedom, unfortunately, is totally incoherent. The only reason that negative freedom matters, the only reason that hindrances matter, is that they're hindering somebody. A prison is only a problem because of the people who are in the prison. The bars and the cement are not a problem in themselves. They're a problem because they're imprisoning someone. Negative freedom only matters as one thing which prevents us from enjoying positive freedom. That is the human capacity to imagine multiple different futures on the basis of our own values and realize some of them. The barriers are one problem, but they're only one problem. They should be removed, I agree. But in order to become free people, we need much more than the removal of barriers. When we define freedom as being nothing more than the removal of barriers, then we find ourselves with an impoverished idea of freedom and with a much less free society than we might have had otherwise. A third problem that we have in the US or in North America, since some of the people who are guilty of this are Canadians, is to talk about rationality rather than, in my view, the more important concept, which is unpredictability. The problem with rationality is that when people speak about rationality, what they tend to be doing is saying, I have some values, but we're not going to talk about those values. We're just going to talk about how we get to my values. We're going to assume that my values are correct, and then we're going to say that rationality is about realizing my values. And then the blurry move is made to say, if you don't agree with me, then you're irrational, right? So if you actually talk about values that are different from the values of the person who's holding forth or the person who's holding power, that means that you're not rational, you're irrational. And of course, it's very hard to recover from the accusation of being irrational. The problem with all of this is not with reason. I'm all in favor of reason. The problem with all of this is that reason only makes you free when it's combined with values. And we all have very different values, right? So what happens is that from a power position, people say those who have other values are irrational, right? And so this is why, for me, it's not rationality that should be at the center of the discussion. It's rather human unpredictability. It's our capacity using both reason and values to come up with selves that are unique and to imagine futures that are various. I'll return to that point. Now, of course, the reasons why we talk about freedom in the wrong way have something to do with the world. So just as I've made 3 points about how we talk about freedom in the wrong way, I'm going to make 3 quick points about what's wrong with the world that leads us to do this. The first thing which is wrong with the world is, I mean, lots of things are wrong with the world, of course, but I'm just going to focus on 3. The first one, which perverts the way we talk about freedom, is wealth inequality. So the fact that a few dozen people in the world own as much as half of the world population, or the fact that a few dozen people in the United States own half as much as half the American population, those things are not just numbers. Those aren't just quantities. Those are also qualities. The fact that we live in this way literally perverts the language. It means that we tend to talk, for example, about freedom of speech in terms of the rights of oligarchs to project their voices over the internet. It means that we tend to talk about the free market, which, as I've said before, exports the freedom of most of us to the direction of few of us. But perhaps the worst thing about wealth inequality is the way that it makes us predictable. I mean, from Plato to Holbach in the 18th century to many fine thinkers in the present, it's been noted that when wealth accumulates, it's not neutral. When wealth is in a very few hands, the way that those very few hands deploy that wealth is predictable. They deploy it in order to maintain that wealth. And that, of course, changes the language. That changes the whole culture. And then finally, last but not least, the problem with wealth inequality is that it stops social mobility. It keeps us from having this thing which we used to call the American dream. A second problem with the world, so now I'm talking about the problems with the world which make it difficult for us to talk about freedom. This is the second of three. A second problem with the world, which is very much relevant to Silicon Valley, is what I would call technological betrayal. So we have this idea, or we had this idea. You can tell me if we still have this idea. We had this idea of something called high technology. And high technology was high technology, not just because it was efficient. The notion of high technology was that high technology would take care of certain things in the world, thereby allowing human beings to think about and further human values. So high technology wasn't just bigger, better, faster. High technology meant richer, deeper, profounder, because it was meant to allow us to become more human, right? To develop the values and habits of thoughts associated with the humanities. It strikes me, and this is what I mean by technological betrayal, that much of the technology to which we actually answer and which dominates our lives is not high technology at all. It's very simple, but that's not the point. The point is that it lowers us, it disables us, it removes our capacities. And I'm speaking, of course, in particular of social media, which I regard not as high technology because it's not, it's very simple, but I regard it as lowering technology in the same sense that high technology was high technology. High technology was meant to enable us to become more ourselves. Lowering technology is technology which makes us simpler, which bestializes us, which reduces us. Much has been written, and I've written some myself, about how this works in politics. So I'll just make this very brief. When social media follows models which have to do with soliciting our desires and our fears, the result is that we become caricatures of ourselves. We become cardboard cutouts of ourselves. We become very predictable. We become very polarized. And also we lose our sense of the future. Everything that happens seems to be happening right now. So that's one technological betrayal. A second technological betrayal, which affects the way we think about freedom very much, is hydrocarbons. We're still relying on what is essentially an obsolete technology, a technology which has been regarded as obsolete for half a century now in various ways. And the fact that we're so dependent upon hydrocarbons, the fact, for example, that most of the carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere have been emitted since everyone knew that global warming was a problem, this affects the way we talk about freedom because it collapses our time horizon. If freedom is all about individual human beings with different values, thinking about individual futures, then climate change is a problem, not just because it can make the species extinct, which I grant is a bad thing probably, but because when the time horizon of everybody collapses in the same way, then we cease being creatures who have individual futures that we can try to realize, and we start being some kind of mass or a collection of tribes that is all afraid of the same thing. Which leads me to the third problem in the world, which is climate change itself. Climate change itself is having a terrifying effect on the way that we talk about freedom. Obviously, as we can anticipate, no one is going to be free at the end of the world. But it's that very anticipation which is also stifling. Because rather than having each of us a chance to think and anticipate an individual future, to imagine a future that we could realize on the basis of what we as individuals cherish, choose to value, we see it closing for everyone in the same way. And along with this, by the way, comes the idea that the real disaster is not climate change, right? Many of us think that's the real disaster, but other Americans think the real disaster is demographic. The real disaster is there aren't going to be enough white people, there'll be too many brown people, and so on, right? That's an alternative disaster. The thing that we know from history about that alternative disaster is that that's preparation for the catastrophe, right? The way that Hitler and Carl Schmitt and others thought about the future was precisely this way. There is no future. It's all ecological struggle. And so the correct way to approach the world is to think about yourself as being under threat, to think about your tribe as being outnumbered. And of course, the logic of that is preemption. So the scenario that I worry about very much is that as we anticipate disaster, it won't just be the disaster that's coming. It will be our various preemptive tribal, ethnic, racial reactions to that disaster, which do us in. Okay, so I promised that this would be a lecture about how things could be very much better than they are. So I've now dug a pretty deep hole, which I will try to climb out of by explaining what I mean by freedom, what freedom is, then by talking about how I think freedom can be realized in the world. And a key underlining point in all of this is that I think freedom and survival are intrinsically and positively related. So for me, freedom is not just some add-in that might be nice as we try to survive. I think that's not how it's going to work at all. I think if we're going to survive by becoming much freer than we are now. Okay, let me try to specify that in clearer and maybe more philosophical language. So my approach here is that I want to define freedom in such a way that it works both at the level of ethics, that is, that when I talk about freedom as ethics, you can agree with me or at least find what I say intelligible when I say that freedom is the highest value of all. At the same time, I want to talk about freedom in a way which is worldly. I want to talk about freedom in such a way that you can see how freedom is emerging over the course of a life, from birth through maturity to death. I want to talk about freedom in such a way that we see that it enables life, not just individual life, but collective life. In other words, I'm going to be trying to avoid what I take to be false, logically false American dichotomies or American oppositions, where we think we have to choose between one thing and another. We tend as Americans to say we have to choose, for example, between security and freedom. That's such a powerful cliche that we almost reflexively pronounce those words. There's a tough, tragic choice we have to choose. And somehow it's always freedom that loses out in that choice. I'm going to be making the opposite case here. I'm going to be saying that freedom and survival actually work together. And indeed, that our habit as Americans of accepting that we have to choose between the two is in fact what is one of the things that is dooming us. That itself is a form of submission and a kind of preparation for how we go extinct. So how then could we have a freedom that is both ethical and worldly? Let me start with the ethics. Let me take a few minutes and try to make the case that freedom is the highest of values. So when I say that freedom is the highest of values, what I mean is that freedom is the thing that allows us to evaluate. It allows us to choose among other values like loyalty or patriotism or fidelity or concentration or love or friendship or beauty. Freedom is the thing that allows us to evaluate those things and allows us to try to combine them as best we can at a certain specific point in life and allows us to realize them. So those values, of course, differ from one person to another. Each of us who's present here has a different idea of how important, let's say, loyalty is versus honesty. And that's normal, and that's good. But that's not where the issue ends. It doesn't end with diversity. Of course, we are morally diverse, but there's another issue here. And the issue is that the values themselves contradict. So there are lots of values. Values, in my view, are as real as things, but they contradict. Just as things can't take up the same space in a room, values sometimes can't take up the same space in a moment. So loyalty and honesty, to use those examples that I just gave, it's very hard to be loyal and honest at the same time. If you want to be a friend, that's a third value, you have to judge when you're going to be loyal and when you're going to be honest. That doesn't mean that you have to choose fatally and tragically among them and always be one or the other. It means that you have to be a free person to be constantly judging, to feel that you have the authority and the ability to constantly make choices among those values in a different setting every day throughout life. So the point is not at all that there's one value and all the other values fit into it. That's the totalitarian view. The view that I'm trying to advance is the pluralist view, the view that says there are many values, we have different ideas about which values are important, the values themselves contradict our intention, and freedom is the will and the capacity to create those combinations, always new combinations, and to realize some of them in the world. Now, to do this, as I've already suggested, requires time. It requires the ability to be, let's say, loyal at moment A, but then honest at moment B, which we choose because we're free people. If we can do all of this over time, it means that when we look back on our lives, in retrospect, we will see that we've had an interesting and unique life. It means that when we look forward, when we look prospectively, we will realize that we and other free people are unpredictable. We're unpredictable because we combine values in different ways, because our values are always different, and also because there's no final list of values. So at this point, I should make the case that this is possible. So that's what I'd like to try to do now. If freedom is the highest value in principle, okay, perhaps that's all well and good, but where does this rich idea of freedom leave us? And notice that it is a rich idea, right? If we stop at negative freedom, things are very simple. We can just say, oh, it's just a matter of getting the government off our backs. But that's not what government is for. The purpose of government is not to get off our backs. The purpose of government, in my view, the one legitimate purpose of government, is to make us free. And that's not as simple as getting off our backs. It requires enabling us to be able to do things. So this is the case that I want to make, that freedom has to do with creating free people, or it has to do with the self-aware creation of institutions, which make it easier, which make it more likely that people will become free. That's what I mean by the title of this lecture. When I talk about forms of freedom, by a form of freedom, I mean something which connects the ethic of freedom to the world outside. A form of freedom is something which is both ethical and worldly at the same time. And because a form of freedom has to do both with ethics within us and with the world without us, we can sometimes see it as we move over the course of a life. So as I enunciate these 5 forms of freedom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we will also be moving through the course of a life from birth to maturity. Before I do this, though, I want to make a specific point again, or I want to return to this point about reason. So the point of reason is not that we submit to the world as it is. So much of what people say about rationality in the United States is reactionary, because what people are saying is it's irrational to have anything besides what we have now. Rationality means, it doesn't, in popular discourse anyway, rationality means something like, let's rationalize the way things as they already are. Let's not imagine how they might be different. That view of reasoning is disempowering and authoritarian. For me, reason is very important, but it works a different way. What reason allows us to do is it allows us to evaluate, and reason allows us to have knowledge of the world. The knowledge of the world we need, not because the world tells us that we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do the other thing. we need to understand the world scientifically and well in order to find the ways around, in order to find the ways through, in order to find the ways over and under. This was the attitude, by the way, that the founders of the United States had about science. Science was meant to enable ever more. It was meant to allow us to find ways over, under, through the world so that we could be freer people. It's this attitude about science which is important to my idea of freedom. We know much more than the founders did about the way the world works, about, for example, child development, which I'm going to return to in a moment. Because we know more about the way the world works, we can have a broader and a richer idea of freedom. In other words, a positive attitude towards science is one that enables us to see the places where we can ever better apply our values. Okay, let me try to be more specific about this as I turn to the forms of the forms of freedom. There will be 5. The first form of freedom, as I understand it, is sovereignty. So I'm going to use the term sovereignty in perhaps a very different sense than the one to which we are accustomed. What I mean by sovereignty is the creation of an individual human being who has the capacity, has the capacities necessary to be free. What it seems to me that more important than national sovereignty and state sovereignty and all the other forms of sovereignty that we talk about, more important than that, and logically in many ways antecedent to all of that, is the notion of a sovereign human being. My view is that freedom makes no sense unless we first have a concept, but also a realization of a human being who is capable of the acts that are necessary to be free. Now, I'm putting the spotlight on this because I think a lot of the problems with our Anglo-Saxon way of talking about freedom have to do with ignoring this. I think that a lot of the way that we write about freedom in English, especially since the 19th century, assumes that the prerequisites for freedom are already in place. There is, for example, already a British Empire. There is already property. There is already education. And the person writing about freedom is already an adult, propertied, let's say, white male. So that all of those assumptions, right, are the very thing that we have to question if we want to have a richer and better idea of freedom. What I want to suggest is that since we know much more than thinkers in the 19th century, since we know much more than the founders in the 18th century about the world, and in particular, in this case, about child development, we can shift the way we think about freedom and emphasize the first 5 years of life. Now, I realize this may seem like an eccentric view, right? Who talks about babies and freedom at the same time? Well, I can tell you who does. With parents talk about freedom and freedom and babies at the same time. But I mean this absolutely seriously. Given what we now know about the science of brain development, it's quite clear that the capacities that we would need to be free people, capacities like the naming of emotions or self-control, right? That these are things which babies learn or don't learn as a result of having contact with other human beings. Now, there's something here very, very important to note, right? Lord Acton, who's a very interesting conservative thinker on freedom, emphasizes the importance of self-control, and he's absolutely right to do so. But you cannot learn self-control by yourself. You can only learn self-control with the help of others. And this is true of everyone. We were all children once. We were all babies once. And in all of our cases, things like naming emotions. In order to become a free person, one has to be able to distinguish emotional reactions from deeply held values. But we can't do that unless we have names for our own emotions, unless we can reflect about our own emotions. That is learned, and it can't be learned without the help of other people. What I mean by sovereignty is that we have enough of this reflectiveness, enough of this self-control, enough of this capacity to name emotions and so on, that we're capable of doing the things that I talked about earlier that freedom demands, namely evaluate, make choices, try again, combine, recombine. That's what I mean by sovereignty. But you'll have noticed a larger point here, a kind of what seems to be a paradox about freedom, namely this, that of course, freedom inheres in individuals, right? Freedom is about creating individuals who have different and irreplicable notions of what's right and wrong. Freedom is individual in that sense. As ethics, it's absolutely individual. But freedom is worldly in the sense that you can't create the freedom, you can't create freedom, you can't create that free individual without a certain kind of world around that individual. And this is clearest when we talk about babies. And this is, by the way, why people who talk about freedom generally don't talk about babies, because if you talked about babies, it would make this point absolutely clear. Freedom may be ethically individual, but freedom in the world is a result of social work. It demands social labor and social work. And in particular, it demands certain kinds of policies. I mean, it demands policies which we don't usually associate with freedom, things like parental leave or longer vacations or early child education. The best justification for things like that, in my view, is freedom. The second form of freedom is something I've already spoken about. The second form of freedom is unpredictability. I'm going to talk about unpredictability now first by talking about why being predictable is bad, then by talking about why unpredictability is good, and then making a larger point about why unpredictability is a kind of essence of freedom. So one way that we're predictable is that we believe in the lies of others. So this is why people who seek to oppress us like to tell us big lies. If we accept a big lie, then we inhabit the big lie. And we become predictable to the person who's telling the big lie, because after all, it's his or her story, that big lie. So this is what Bakhtin said, right? Bakhtin said that if you cease to become free, if you believe in a big lie, because then you're living in someone else's narration. Another way that we can become predictable is by yielding to social media. So to take the current example of a big lie, the people who stormed the Capitol building on the 6th of January had no personal, so to speak, reason for doing so. They had no personal contact with any evidence which might have led them to think the things that they thought. However, social media had selected them for their vulnerabilities to believe the kinds of things that were proffered to them. And in the end, that led them to take action, which was, in a certain sad way, very predictable, right? So being predictable means not being free. Being predictable means you have a master, whether that master is someone who's telling you a lie, or whether, even more sadly, that master is some kind of digital creation. Being unpredictable, on the other hand, is a job, right? Being unpredictable is the good side effect of being sovereign. So if you are sovereign, if you have these capacities that I've talked about, that means that you will then you'll behave unpredictably in the world. You will have your own combinations of values, and you might be able to realize some of them, and you will do so in a way which is different from what everyone else is doing, right? And so unpredictability in the course of a life comes after sovereignty. And when one takes all this together, one can think about what would follow for policy. But I'll just make a very simple point, which every single one of you in Silicon Valley, I'm sure, has had experience of and thought about. If what we need are children who are sovereign and are unpredictable, this has implications for what we put in front of them and what we put in their classrooms. So every single Silicon Valley oligarch who I know prevents their children from seeing screens, generally of any kind, but certainly no contact with social media. It seems to me that that would be the standard, that should be the standard for how we educate children in general. We have to get them through to the point where they can be sovereign and unpredictable, right? We have to get them through to a certain stage in life. Of course, all of us are vulnerable to the ability of social media to make us predictable, but children perhaps the more so. And so this second form of freedom, unpredictability, suggests this particular policy. I'm just gonna stop though here and stress how important this unpredictability is, not just as the core of freedom as I see it, but also as an element of the beauty of freedom, right? So much of freedom has to do with understanding the world as it is, and then imagining how the world might be different. The imagining of how the world might be different is something that we add to the world. In other words, I understand all the objections from quantum physics, and I'm happy to talk about them. But in general, the more we ascertain about the world, the more we understand the world, the better we are, the more we understand its regularities, right? What we are not, however, is entirely predictable. We're not entirely subject to physical regularities. It's our unpredictability. It's our ability to act on the basis of values, which makes us different from the rest of creation, as far as we know. It's that which makes us different. It's that which makes us beautiful, I think. It's that which allows us to add a whole dimension to the universe, which, when we are extinct, as far as we know, will no longer be there. Okay, let's close that big metaphysical parenthesis and move on to the third form of freedom. The third form of freedom is mobility. So first is sovereignty, second is unpredictability, the third is mobility. Mobility means the ability, as you grow up, to move, right? To move physically, to move according to your own values, which are different perhaps from your parents or your mentors or the older generation. It also demands that we have a sense of time, right? So it demands that we're able to see the future. If we don't have a place to move, if we don't have an idea of where to move or on what basis or why, and we don't think we have the time to do so, then we are much less free. Historically, some of us or some people have been able to create mobility on the basis of territory, right? So the American history of the frontier, or the history of frontier colonialism in general around the world, is the history of some people being able to move at the expense of other people who are displaced or enslaved or exterminated much of the time, right? So that is a version of mobility which is deeply wound into the way that we often talk about freedom when we're speaking English, but which is obviously morally unacceptable. And it's morally unacceptable, that's enough, and it's also impracticable. So that form of mobility is no longer available. But so other forms of mobility have to be found. And happily, there is another form of mobility, one which we used to have in the United States, and one which is still present in much of Europe. And that is social mobility, right? The idea that it's not territory that matters so much as society, and that one can move into something which we might call a middle class on the basis of one's own efforts, right? That's a very attractive idea. And then when one is in this middle class, one can then live a life according to one's own values, because the material things have been taken care of. That's what middle class means. One can then express and realize one's own values. If one were to take that idea of mobility seriously, right, it would have very significant effects on how we thought about policy, right? Because then freedom would become an argument for caring about how the labor market works. Freedom would become an argument for making sure that there's public transportation. Freedom would become an argument for making sure that there's a welfare state, because all of those things are needed for young people to have mobility. Freedom, by the way, would also become an argument for labor unions, because all those things are needed for mobility, right? For mobility. And here again, we run across this apparent paradox in freedom. Any child who reaches the age of 18 or 21, any American child who reaches maturity, may want to move freely into the world. But no child, no young person can make a world in which that's possible, right? So much of our entertainment industry collapses this difference, and we try to teach ourselves that as individuals, it's all we have to do is want it enough. And that's just not true. An American born in the 1940s has a much, much bigger chance of moving socially than an American born in the 1980s. An American born in the 1980s, as I was, has a much better chance of moving socially than an American born today. It's not enough to want it. It's not even enough to be, this is in my language, sovereign and unpredictable. You have to have mobility, but you can't create the mobility on your own. the mobility has to be there for you, it has to be awaiting you. In other words, mobility is generational work. It's work that has to be done for an older generation, by an older generation for a younger generation. And it's national work. A nation which values freedom is going to create the institutions such that mobility will be possible for the generations to come, right? You might even say that that would be what an American nation actually means. And here again, we see this apparent paradox, which is that freedom is exercised individually. Freedom in here is in individuals. Freedom is about individuals, in this case, becoming mobile. But you can't create freedom individually. The conditions for freedom can only be created socially. Okay, the fourth form of freedom is solidarity. So in my field, in the history of Eastern Europe, there's this unforgettable slogan from the trade union Solidarity of 1980, 1981, which is there's no freedom without solidarity. And this is logically true. There is no freedom without solidarity. This is logically true at a number of different levels. For one thing, as I've just tried to argue, you cannot create the conditions of freedom on your own. If you are going to become free, that's because people around you also value freedom and have created conditions in which you might become free as you grow up from being an infant to an adult. It's also philosophically consistent, as Charles Taylor pointed out long ago. If you value freedom and you identify yourself as a free person, that is the same thing as wishing that that identity be possible for everyone else. And wishing that that identity be possible for everyone else involves wanting the institutions or wanting the practices that's going to make that possible. So the final way that I might talk about solidarity as the fourth form of freedom would be to consider what the opposite of solidarity is, and how the opposite of solidarity gets us into a whole heap of oppressive trouble. The opposite of solidarity is escapism. So escapism can mean, and this is a terrible problem in the world we live in, and a problem which a very distorted idea of freedom enables, and I think a correct idea of freedom would help to address. One problem in the world are tax havens. One problem in the world, and scandal after scandal reveals this, is just how easy it is for people to park their wealth in places beyond which tax authorities can reach. That's obviously a problem, because that makes it very much harder for that wealth to be diverted towards areas of activity which would make lots and lots of people free. As I said earlier, it's absolutely predictable that the very wealthy will behave this way, and the wealthier they are, the more predictable it becomes, right? And of course, it's also predictable that extreme inequalities of wealth will guide the conversation in such a way that we'll think that freedom is only about protecting extreme inequalities of wealth. We have to address that head on. If we understand solidarity as a form of freedom, which it is, then it will immediately seem ridiculous to us that person A's ability to offshore $7 billion is more important than person B's, than the need of person B to get early childhood education, especially if we're not talking about just person B, but we're talking about, let's say, 15 million people B, whose early childhood education could have been funded by that amount of money. Another form of escapism is the idea of immortality, which is one of my least favorite ideas, and I could talk a lot about it. But immortality is another kind of monopoly. It's a claim of monopoly over the future, that a few people are going to have forever, and the rest of us are going to have very little or nothing at all. The claim to immortality moves some people out of the attempt to solve problems at the level of the nation or the society. And as I've tried to argue before, the problem of freedom is one of those that has to be addressed at the level of freedom of society or of the nation as a whole. Another kind of escapism is escape from the planet, right? This idea that what's going to happen is that a few of us are going to make it off and the rest of us are going to stay here, and then a few of us will survive and colonize other planets. It isn't going to happen, right? I mean, first of all, it just isn't going to happen. But this way of thinking, right, the celebration of the few who will try and fail to escape Earth, costs us the ability to think in terms of solidarity, that if we're going to be free and survive, we're going to have to do it on this earth and together. Okay, that was very brief. The fifth form of freedom is like solidarity. So the fifth form of freedom is factuality, and it's like solidarity in that it's a value on which freedom depends. Unpredictability, sovereignty, and mobility, they're about stages of life. They're about moving through life. Solidarity and factuality, or if you prefer, truth, these are values which have to be present, which we all have to endorse to even have a shot at having any other forms of freedom. So factuality is extremely important or necessary for freedom, because factuality allows us to form groups in civil society of like-minded individuals who care about the same things. Factuality allows us to have a court system without findings of fact. You can't have findings of law. Factuality is absolutely essential for democratic discussion of any kind, because it's a good and unavoidable thing that our values will differ. But if our facts also differ, then we are actually unable to have public discussion, as we've seen recently on a number of occasions. Factuality is also necessary for freedom because it's a form of self-defense. The very wealthy, the oligarchs, will always have spectacle. They will always have spectacle on their side. So if everything is just a matter of feeling, right? If feeling really is first, if everything really is about feeling, then the oligarchs always win, because the oligarchs will always be able to mobilize feeling in a way that citizens as individuals will not be able to do. But if factuality is taken seriously, then every citizen, every person at least has a form of self-defense. Factuality is for that. And factuality is also for asserting oneself into the world, right? So all of these problems of factuality, of spectacle, all of this is in the classics. So, so Aristotle is worried about this, precisely about spectacle. Plato believes that if you have too much inequality, that will create what he calls the two different cities living in different discursive and moral worlds. Everything that I've just said was understood to people who had seen democracy fall, right? Who had seen its weaknesses more than 2,000 years ago. Euripides, who lived at the time in classical Greece when democracy was at its height, makes the more optimistic point about freedom and democracy, one which I think we should hold on to with both hands and probably both feet. His point about speech is that the point of free speech is to speak uncomfortable truths to power. That is what free speech is all about. Free speech is not about oligarchs having infinite digital platforms to express their daily worries. Freedom of speech is not about bots on the internet repeating things for money for anonymous people. That's not what freedom of speech is about. Perhaps having freedom of speech inevitably leads to those unfortunate side effects. But what freedom of speech is actually about, the way freedom of speech allows us to become free or allows us to inject freedom into our political system, is that it enables speaking truth to power, right? Freedom of speech is about daring. If we're just saying something that everybody wants to think, there's no point bringing up freedom of speech there, right? If we're just saying something that we're being paid to say that pleases someone who has much more wealth than we do, there's no point of invoking freedom of speech there. You're not going to have a problem. You're never going to get into trouble repeating what everyone wants to hear. You're never going to get into trouble repeating some platitude which serves the interests of very wealthy people. But you can get in trouble in a good way, right? And what John Lewis used to call good trouble. You can get into trouble in a good way by speaking truth to power, but you can't do it without truth. You can't speak truth to power without truth. And truth does not arise from the ground on its own. Like everything else that I've been talking about, truth requires a certain amount of careful, attentive creation of institutions. It's just not true, as much of our tradition from Milton through John Stuart Mill would suggest. Much of that Anglo-Saxon American tradition would suggest that there's a quote unquote free market, right? Watch out, there's never a free market. There's a quote unquote free market of ideas. And then that free market of ideas, the good ideas always win. Simply not true. The truth does not rise to the top by any natural process. The truth only arises if we take truth as a value, if we believe in it, but also if we take care to create the institutions which produce the facts. So again, this suggests certain kinds of policies. If we care about freedom, we have to care about factuality. If we care about factuality, then we have to be in a position to support institutions that create facts, that produce facts. I mean, it's actually astonishing. It's astonishing what we now take to be factuality, right? We take to be factuality the things that the internet is able to repeat to all of us at the same time. Meanwhile, what we have lost is knowledge about whether the school board is corrupt, knowledge about whether there's mercury or lead in the water. We have lost the knowledge that people 30 or 40 years ago actually had about their lives or could have from local reporting. Most of the United States is now a news desert. Most of the counties in the United States no longer have a single reporter actually writing about what's happening in those counties. It is very difficult to build freedom on that basis. So factuality requires, for example, that after we break up the social media giants, we tax them in such a way that local media, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, local media that gives people the basic knowledge about themselves that they need can be allowed to arise again. So I'm coming to the conclusion now, but I want to say one final thing about factuality. In the US, we talk a lot about free speech. It's very important for me that we understand that a more important concept than free speech is the concept of free speakers. I think even in such apparently attractive examples as free speech, we have to be very careful whenever we see the word freedom put in front of something besides people. Free speech is only relevant insofar as there are free speakers. So free speech was, of course, is guaranteed in lots of constitutions, including the Soviet Constitution, which arose under Stalin. That the notion of free speech, declaratively invoking free speech, is really not so important. What is important is the ability to create free speakers, free people. And so the fifth form of freedom is factuality, because we need factuality to create free speakers. If everybody is under somebody else's spell, if everybody is predictable because they follow the same digital stuff, then we are not free. So factuality is a necessary form of freedom. We need free people. We need free speakers. And so in order to have free speakers, you have to have factuality. You have to have solidarity, mobility. You have to have sovereignty, and you have to have unpredictability. And so you have to have the institutions which are necessary, which are behind the creation of all of those forms of freedom. So this brings me to the conclusion. I'm just going to repeat here what it is that I was trying to do, and hope that you'll agree that I've done at least some of it, and then I'll look forward to the discussion. I've been trying to make the case that freedom, properly understood, is both ethical and worldly. That we can make the case, a correct case, I think, that freedom is the highest value, not because freedom absorbs or subsumes all of the other values, but rather because freedom is that thing which allows us to choose among those other values, combine and recombine those other values, realize some of those values in the world, thereby changing the world in the direction of some value and leaving the trace of an unpredictable human life. That freedom is ethical. But I've been also trying to make the case that freedom is worldly, that freedom isn't a word that we should just be tossing around. It's not a word that we should be using to make one another less free, as we very often do in the United States. That freedom is worldly and that it directs actions in the world. If we take seriously that's the highest value, then we have to ask, what are the forms in which it can be realized in a life? And in this lecture, I've made the case that those forms are 5. Those forms are sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, solidarity, and factuality. And that it follows from this, if we accept these forms of freedom, it follows from this that we would then need the institutions, right? It would then follow what government should then do, what policy should then be, would then follow from this expansive, from this rich idea of what freedom actually means. We have the forms of freedom are requirements for individual freedom, and therefore they are justifications for specific policies, some of which I have mentioned. And then finally, and I'm sure you've caught this point along the way, when I say that freedom is worldly, I also mean that freedom is a way to keep us in the world. Freedom is a way to help us survive. The things that we need to survive, like, for example, addressing climate change, those are not just a matter of survival, they're also a matter of freedom. Addressing climate change would give us a sense of time that we all need in order to believe that we can realize values in the future. So when I say that freedom is ethical and worldly, what I mean is also that there isn't fundamentally a clash, at least from where we stand, between surviving as a species and becoming freer as individuals in American society, that these two things actually will work together if freedom is properly understood. That's my case. I'm very grateful for having had the chance to make it, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. We have about more than 400 people watching and a lot of questions. We're going to try to go till about, for another 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more than that. And I will try to pass on the questions to you as I get them and try to pull them together into a coherent conversation between you and our audience. First thing I want to say, though, is just a message to everyone watching, which is that it's been about a year ago, I think it was a year ago today, was our last presidential lecture in the humanities and arts. The speaker was the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe. And anyone can find the video of that event on our website if you care to go back and look at it. It's quite instructive. And if you put these two presidential lectures together, I think it's clear that we live in a moment of both intellectual ferment and existential crisis, in which scholars with very different professional and intellectual trajectories are converging on certain questions. We live in a moment in which, as I was thinking when Tim, when you were talking, we live in a moment in which historians who might once have been talking about the past are now talking about the future. Political philosophers who used to talk about power are now talking about survival. And what I would call interpretive scholars like myself, scholars of literature or art history or music, instead of talking about works of art, are now talking about the world. So with that as sort of the frame around this, and inviting our viewers to go back and look at the events of our past year at the Humanities Center in that light, I want to start by asking you something that is a very practical question that grows out of the central issue of the talk, the nature of, it's almost a philological question, really, the way you begin. It's about the nature of freedom as both a word and a concept. And you, quite interestingly and provocatively, out at the top of the talk, you made the point that we have to watch out for that adjective free when it is applied under certain conditions where it is in fact what we're observing is something very much not free. If you were advising a member of the public who's watching this event, because we live in a world in which, especially a media world that is saturated with usages of the word freedom and free, how would you advise people to gloss that term? How would you advise them to read critically when they encounter terms like freedom and free in just the course of everything we read and experience over the course of the day. With what sort of critical apparatus or lens should we be thinking about that?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, so when you kindly mentioned in your introduction my book, The Road to Unfreedom, and I think I used the word unfreedom and on tyranny as well.
Mm-hmm.
And as you likely know, that's not a word which is used often in English, but yeah. It's a word that exists in Slavic languages. So, for example, Havel uses it in Power of the Powerless, which is an important essay for me. And the notion of unfreedom, the reason why the word unfreedom is good, because it keeps the word freedom in there and it reminds us that somehow freedom is involved. The thing about the notion of unfreedom is that we take part in our own oppression. And Havel and many others before him and after him, Klemperer, and then there's a whole host of feminist and African American linguists who are making similar arguments like around of this sort. Wittgenstein, the point being that when we volunteer to use words in a certain way, we're also volunteering to abandon the substance of them, right? So I would say that every time you hear the word freedom in America, you should prick your ears up because it's abused almost all the time. I mean, I think we're reaching this point where it's almost all form and almost no substance. The trick, the easiest, the application that I would propose is that you ask, where is the person? So when someone uses the word freedom, the question is, where is the person, right? And because very often the person is nowhere, or very often the person is one person, and the way we're talking about freedom means less freedom for 1 million people. Mm-hmm. So for me, the first trick is, where is the person? Where are the people? Is the thing that's being proposed here going to enable people to live free, to live free lives?
Great. Here's a question from the audience, and this is perhaps more of a scholarly than a practical question. You didn't mention, I'm quoting the audience member, you didn't mention liberalism in your lecture, I think, but your definition of freedom as the highest value because it allows to choose among others sounds similar to classical defenses of liberalism. Are you seeking to distinguish your definition from traditional concepts of liberalism, or do you see yourself as thinking within a liberal framework?
So I think, when you try to do something new, you have to make two moves. The first move is to say that everyone else is wrong, and the second move is to say that everyone else is right. So my view of this is that the conservatives, the socialists, and the liberals are all correct. So the liberals are correct that freedom is the highest value. The conservatives are correct that freedom is nonsensical without values, and that most of the way that we understand values has to do with the past. And the socialists are correct that it's impossible to create free people without carefully modulated institutions. So I don't mind being called a liberal. I'm not one of the people, because I think liberals are right. But if someone had the notion to call me a conservative, there are some ways in which I'm very sympathetic to conservatism. And if someone were to say you're a socialist because you're in favor of free childhood education and universal healthcare and so on, I'd say fine. If that makes me a socialist, it makes me a socialist. I mean, this is actually essential to my way of arguing for what freedom is. That what appear to be irresolvable contradictions, what we find convenient in politics to be irresolvable contradictions, often can be brought together, and indeed may need to be brought together to have a coherent idea of freedom.
And a related question also from the audience about a word that wasn't heard in the talk. Mm-hmm. Where is racism in all of this as a factor that could inhibit some of these different kinds of freedom? How do we account for it?
Well, racism, I mean, I didn't use the word just like I didn't use liberalism, but mm-hmm. Racism was at the very top of the talk when I talked about one of the ways that freedom can be perverted. And I'll now gloss that again to try to make it clearer. From Reconstruction forward, and Du Bois makes this case very cleanly and nicely in Black Reconstruction in 1935. From Reconstruction forward, the argument has been made to white Americans that equal treatment of Black Americans means some kind of mistreatment of white Americans. In the third quarter and the fourth quarter of the 20th century, especially under Reagan, but not only, we see the argument made that we can't have health insurance and we can't have a welfare state in general for all of us because the Black people will abuse it. So, and by the way, white people don't need this stuff because you're all frontiersmen, right? You're all hardy individualists and so on and so forth. So you don't really need this stuff. And in that way, we disable ourselves from being a society which could provide what I see as the requisites of freedom for everybody, and we become a more tribal society or a racist society, I'm happy to use the word, in which many white people's idea of freedom is collective. As a collective, as a tribe, we have stuff that somebody else doesn't have. And that stuff, so it's collective and it's relative, right? So I'm less likely to be incarcerated. I'm less likely to be arrested, right? Those things that are called white privilege, but I prefer to try to keep them into my own category of freedom. That then becomes an unbelievably limited notion of freedom. Because if American white people accept that notion of freedom, that we as a collective are somehow relatively better off than some other collective, then you're basically inviting oppression, right? So as an element of American unfreedom, racism is absolutely central, right? And so then when I speak of I meant to put the word decarceration in the talk, and I just forgot. But decarceration, in the broadest sense, would be part of the response, where decarceration means not just the thing that many people can agree on, that there should be fewer people behind bars, but where decarceration also means removing the unequal access to the welfare state that was of the 60s and 70s, or actually earlier, from the 30s through the 70s, removing that and rebuilding a welfare state which involves everybody equally. There's a lot to discuss here. There's a lot of recent scholarship about how, about, for example, Elizabeth Hinton's work about about the war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on crime, which demonstrates how an attitude of racism informs institutional decisions, which end up first taking the welfare state away from Black people, and then in stage two, taking it away from everyone. My case, I want to ennoble and I want to expand the word freedom for this purpose. My case is that doing that was not just an injury to Black people and an episode of political foolishness by a lot of us, but that it makes freedom much more difficult for everyone, because it gets us into these cycles where some of us define freedom as being less badly off as a collectivity than another collectivity, and that's not freedom at all.
Okay, one more question in this vein, that is people asking about terms that are lurking around the edges of the talk. First liberalism, then racism. Now here's the third one. I'm quoting the questioner. What is the nature of the relationship between freedom and equality? You've not mentioned equality in your talk, neither as a value in itself, nor as a prerequisite for achieving freedom. How is freedom possible in an unequal world? To what extent is eradication of this equality possible in your view? Redistribution of wealth, collective of ownership of resources, possible or desirable? Second, what is the impact of your idea of freedom on the way the American empire conducts itself globally?
Mm-hmm. So for me, freedom is the highest value. That's the case that I'm making. And with respect to the policies which the questioner suggested or listed, with all of which I would no doubt agree, the case I'm trying to make is that there isn't a tension between freedom and those policies. Of course, you can justify those policies in terms of equality. I agree 100%. Is equality a virtue? Yes, right? Of course it's a virtue. But the case I'm trying to make is that these same policies can be justified in terms of the value that I take to be the highest one, which is freedom, and in terms of a value which many Americans, and now we're turning from the ethical to the worldly, which many Americans would also acknowledge to be a high value. So in practical political terms, there may be a reason for thinking about these things, not as just the province of a left, which agrees with all of the things that you say, and which I'm happy to repeat, but as the province of a country which cares about freedom. So I can only mention a few policies in a talk of this length, but you might have noticed that the policies that I mentioned were things like ending tax havens for billionaires, or healthcare for everyone, or reviving the welfare state, right? I believe in all of those things, but I actually believe that the strongest case for them can be made from freedom, both ethically and politically. So is equality a value? Yes, equality is a value, but my view is that freedom is ethically prior, because without freedom, no other values, including equality, can be discussed and realized or prioritized. Without freedom, we can't make the case that equality is a very important value. Without freedom, we don't even know how much inequality there is, and so on. So it's not that so this is my whole point, right? I'm not saying that freedom is the kind of value where you have to say, is it freedom or equality, right? My whole point is that that's not what freedom is. There is no single value which rules out or subordinates all of the other values. Freedom is a different sort of value than equality. You can't put the two of them against each other, because what freedom does is it enables us to make exactly the kind of point which the questioner makes in the question, which is, I think this value is important and it would lead to these things. Freedom is the value which enables that kind of questioning, right? So there's not a clash here. The surprising thing, in the analysis, I hope, or the interesting thing, is that if you understand freedom in this way, it doesn't have to lead you the way that people think Isaiah Berlin has led us, right? It doesn't have to lead you away from the welfare state. It doesn't have to lead you towards oligarchy. If you understand freedom richly in this way, in my view, in which, for example, solidarity, I use solidarity, right? Because I think it actually captures more than equality does. I think solidarity is a form of freedom. If you think freedom requires solidarity, then your freedom is actually leading you towards a richer conceptual and political world in which these very policies that we likely agree on every one should be, and perhaps even could be implemented. On American Empire, that's under mobility. So I was trying, when I said, settlers used to steal their quantum of unpredictability from the people they exploited and enslaved. This is no longer practically possible, right? And it's, of course, also morally unacceptable. In the American tradition of freedom, and also in the British, right, in this common discussion of freedom, there has always been the assumption that there's more territory to conquer, that there are other people out there who do not deserve the protection of the law. That is the implicit assumption if it's not explicitly stated. When I talk about mobility as the third condition, one of the things that I'm trying to get at is that we have to move from an imperial notion of mobility to a social notion of mobility. And we know that it's possible because many European countries have done it. And we know that it's possible because in some ways the US was moving in that direction before we changed course in the 1980s. And this relates to history very deeply, and it relates back to the first question about racism. One of the reasons why getting the history of race in this country right is so important is that if you don't get the history of race right, then you can't get the future right. If you think that the history of race is all about like sometimes the white people and sometimes the black people, and if you think it's all about like making everybody feel good, if you think that's what history is about, then you can't confront the future, right? So getting the history of the American empire, as you call it, right? In the book that I'm writing, I also call it the empire. If you get the history, you have to get that history right if you want to have an American democracy. So, I mean, I've now spent a lot of time answering the question, which I appreciate, but I'm sure there are some other ones.
Well, thank you. And I think that especially your, what you just said about the place of freedom among other values and the fact that it enables others, I think that that's an important, lends an important perspective to the rest of the talk. Let's turn the page and with a different kind of question. And this is a questioner who wants to focus in on one of the forms of freedom and sort of ask you a definitional question. In your argument for freedom, how much is unpredictability dependent on the existence of predictability? For instance, shared predictability of action, habits among individuals or within institutions. Is it the case that there needs to be more predictability than unpredictability in the world, in your view? And does that present you with a problem?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I mean, it's a beautiful dialectical observation that if I want to raise children or educate children to have the capacity to be unpredictable, it is predictable what I need to give them. It's predictable that I must keep them out of extreme poverty. It's predictable that I must not allow them to go hungry. It's predictable that they must have a lot of time with humans. It's predictable that they have to have access to situations in which they learn to make choices. It's predictable that they have to have lots of eye contact. All of those things are predictable. So the collective things are all predictable, right? And so knowing what's predictable about the world, including the social world, is precisely what allows us to create unpredictability, right? And this is true. So I just gave the example of child development. It's also true of climate change. It is absolutely predictable that emitting more carbons into the atmosphere will warm the climate in such a way, right? That's absolutely predictable. Knowledge of that predictability enables us, hopefully, to come up with unpredictable solutions. But if we don't have the knowledge of the regularities, whether they're regularities about our bodies or regularities about the earth, then we can't enable the unpredictable responses. So no, I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it's actually, that's just the way things are. I mean, it's the same, it's an aesthetically similar tension, to this thing that I called an apparent paradox. It's actually the same one, it's just phrased in a different way. If we want to have free people, we have to act socially. And the way that we have to act socially, we can pretty much say in advance. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to create the talk. But it's precisely that knowledge about what we have to do, which enables people to be unpredictable, right? So it's not a problem. It's just it's sort of. I mean, I think it's beautiful. Actually, I think that's beautiful and dialectical. And I think it's necessary because there's so many places in where we think about freedom that we just accept that there's some kind of tragic problem. And what I'm trying to say is that these tragic problems are just ways that, these tragic problems, most of them, they're not just things we can get around. I think they often just don't exist.
This will be the last question, I think. And it's different again. What are your thoughts on artificial intelligence, which primarily functions to more accurately predict things? Is the problem with AI, as opposed to social media, that we are using it to predict people as opposed to things? Can AI ever be used to bolster freedom, or if we can apply it to support our values?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think the basic issue, not just with artificial intelligence, but with computer programming, software engineering in general, is the vacuity of ethical discussion. So we made all these technical leaps starting in the 1980s. When I was very excited about them, and I was a programmer when I was a kid. Like I was like it's like you were a teenage werewolf or libertarian. You could be a teenage programmer too. It was all real exciting, but the ethical assumptions about where this was going to go was pretty vacuous. Vacuous in the technical sense, like there was just nothing. There was nothing there, and there was this libertarian notion also that things will just sort themselves out, right? Like libertarianism manages to combine the extremes of being unbelievably naive and unbelievably cynical into one idea. And so this unbelievably naive, / unbelievably cynical notion that somehow everything will just sort itself out, right? That all we have to do is create the network and then everything will just sort itself out. With artificial intelligence, we have a specific version of this problem, which is that it's awfully hard to get ethics into human beings. My part of my argument here is that the conservative part of my argument is that values are real, right? Values are as real as the stones in the field, but it's but apprehending them and evaluating them and having your own position on them and imbibing them requires a lot of work, not just individual but also collective. Getting from there to teaching ethics in computer programming courses is another step, and getting us to think that actually the behavior of computer programmers should be ethical in the same way that the behavior of veterinarians or nurses should be ethical, right? Of course, people will violate it, but there should be a code of more or less what's acceptable. We're a long way from that. And honestly, I appreciate the question, because it seems to me that treating these fields as being subject to professional ethics is more important than whatever the next advance might be. I agree with the premise of the question. The problem with artificial intelligence, whatever that might be, we're gonna mark this off, but whatever it might be, is that we tend to use it. We tend to use it in such a way as to make people seem predictable, right? So, for example, when we use very simple algorithms to decide who is on parole who might commit another crime, right? Or when we use very simple algorithms to decide who should we treat as a delinquent and maybe subject to arrest in the future, we're treating people as though they were more predictable than they are, and we tend to reproduce our own. So artificial intelligence, because it can't inject values on its own, often tends to concentrate and reify our own ideas about the way the world works and make the world look more predictable than it is. And once we make the world look more predictable than it is, then we end up acting to make the world more predictable than it is. And I also accept what I take the premise of the question to be, that now I'm just going to step back and be a little more science fiction about it. Why is it exactly that we can't turn artificial intelligence against problems that are not human? I want to see the movie Artificial Intelligence versus Global Warming. I want to see that movie. Why isn't that happening? If artificial intelligence has all this potential and global warming is going to bring an end to us as a species, why isn't there a great encounter of artificial intelligence versus global warming? I'm aware of the efforts to use artificial intelligence at a local level. I know some of the people who are doing precisely that. But what I don't see is why we're not asking that question. Why isn't that we couldn't turn artificial intelligence against the great problem that is actually going to bring us to an end as a species? Why can't that be directed at a much higher level than it is? So I'm agreeing with the premise of that question, and I'm gonna leave it at that, because I think our inability to use artificial intelligence in that way does suggest not only the limits of that technology, it suggests the limits of us. It suggests that one of our limits is our desire to export problem solving when the problem solving itself is not just technical but also a matter of values. Solving climate change isn't just a matter of finding a technical solution. It's also a matter of living in time. It's a matter of expressing solidarity. It's a matter of not being an escapist. It's a matter of all these things which I've tried to associate with freedom. It's a matter of thinking about freedom in terms of the babies who are going to be born in 2050. Into what kind of a world are they going to be free, right? If climate change continues as it is. All these ideas that I've been trying to associate with freedom are about the human values that I think we need to address what might seem to be a technical problem like climate change. Anyway, I appreciate that question.
Tim, as we have to conclude this event, I want to thank you for an extraordinarily provocative presidential lecture. I hope that when the new book is done, or at some point in the near future, I hope you'll come back and see us, ideally in person the next time. And I know our audience would love to hear from you again. So thank you very much. And here's hoping to see you again. We are delighted that so many of you, nearly 500, could join us today. I want to remind you that a recording of the event will be made available on our website soon. Everyone who registered for today's event was entered into a drawing to receive one of 3 copies of Timothy Snyder's best-selling book, On Tyranny, in a new graphic edition. And so I'd like to announce today's winners. They are Ariana Hernandez, Matthew Malloy, and Vera Grant. We'll be in touch with you shortly by email about getting the book to you. And finally, all of us, this is the beginning of our year of programming here. This is the first official event of the year. All of us are looking forward to an intellectually lively year at the Stanford Humanities Center, and we hope you will want to join us for other lectures, for book talks, and other events, both in person and on Zoom. More events are being added to the calendar all the time, so as always, follow our website, shc.stanford.edu, for the latest updates. And so now, good afternoon from the Stanford Humanities Center, and we'll hope to meet you again, either on the farm or on the screen. Thank you.